Never mind. There's actually something I just came up with, which I think helps. Is it's better to look at it like the subjective movement. Like if I started the movement with art, with the story of creation or the story of the beginning of reality, if I started it with a story, with a myth like that, and it was myth oriented, and that's the soul of the movement, if that's the main thrust or the main um, path of the movement or orientation of the movement that it's going down is subjective, in that case, the subjective decisions that the subject, the individual person, makes are all done according to, in this case, it would be the theory, the or lucidity, either one. But that is bad because if a person's subjective value system is this relativistic theory, then that doesn't really fit. There's a contrast there. So the problem happens when a subject tries to become a machine, when a subject tries to become a relative object, or whatever you want to call that. The subject can extend into that, but yet they still are the subject. They don't become wholly that. So, given the fact that this theory is relativistic, the scope of it just is measured in that field, in that dimension only. So it doesn't have anything beyond that field in its purview. Given that, if a person were to apply that to only their subjective evaluation of things, to say, for example, that right and wrong are defined by it, or that things that are cool or uncool, or things that are culturally valuable or things that are not culturally valuable, if that was determined by the theory through the mythos, the cultural establishment of the movement, if that were the case, that is basically a religion. It doesn't have to take the form of a religion. It doesn't have to take the form of deifying something, but it operates the same way that a religion would operate. It doesn't have anything justifying it, for example. It doesn't have any reason that it is that way. It just simply insists that it is this way, just because of its own subjective bent. And that makes the entire thing arbitrary. Now, the problem with it being that way is it takes something that's inherently relative and then it pretends that the subject is somehow able to absorb that relativity inside of the subject, which doesn't make sense because the subject is limited to the field of subjectivity. The subject is not an abstract equation. The subject is not a series of algorithmic functions. The subject is a subject. They have their own ineffable personality structure and soul that can never be rendered into an algorithm. But if you pretend that it could, then you're trying to turn people into machines. That's what the danger is if I tried to make a movement that uses a relativistic theory, but then creates this cultural mythos around it to the point where it pretends that you're supposed to be using this theory to evaluate things morally rather than just legally. Legal law and moral ethics are completely different. They seem similar on the face of it. It seems like the legal law should reflect the moral law. That there should be everything that is evil should be illegal, and everything that is good should be legal. And that's what most people typically hold in their head as the right way of looking at it, which is only the case if you've never really thought about it before. No offense if that's you. It just means that you haven't put the effort or time into learning it. But once you do, then you will have that. Or not, if you don't want it. And it's fine either way, I don't care. But the facts are the way that they are. So if a person doesn't know and they assume that the legal law should also reflect the moral law, the problem is every single individual has their own moral law. For some people, they'll lie to protect their friends and family, and that's morally good to them because they value loyalty to their family more than they do to the system or some, principle of honesty or integrity. Doesn't really mean anything, is subservient to their principle of loyalty. So it just depends on whichever one you arbitrarily places the highest value. And they're all, like I said, subjective. So there's not really a way of determining which one is quote unquote best or worst. It's just whichever one resonates with you as a subject. And because of that, there's a whole slew of different logical positions that you can rationally take, and yet they're all contradictory to each other. Some of them say that you should be an optimist. Some of them say you should be a pessimist. Some of them say that you should be a Marxist. Some of them say you should be a capitalist, etc. So they're all rational. They're all able to be rationalized by a rational agent. In other words, a rational agent can arrive at any random, arbitrary position that you take. You could claim that it's rational to drown your kids in the bathtub. It's just a matter of asserting whichever premises that you want to assert. So those principles that you assert are asserted, justified by your subjective belief system. So it necessarily has to be independent from, as it produces, and nothing can produce itself, the effect or the cause of the rationalization of it. So it has to exist before the rationalization of it, because there's a rationalization for all positions equally. So that doesn't actually point to that position. It just says that, there's all these positions in their entirety as a totality. So to pick one of those and then say, but it means that this one exists. No, it doesn't, because if you say it just means that, then you're excluding the entire field except that one point on it, which would be like saying the ocean is a drop of water. And it's like, no, it's not. It has a drop of water in it, but it isn't a drop of water. And you claiming that the ocean is just this one specific drop is ludicrous. It's the one specific drop is inside the ocean. The ocean isn't inside the droplet, so it's like that type of thing. If I were to take this theory and I were to tell somebody that they should make moral decisions of goodness and evil based upon it, then I would be telling them that the ocean is inside of a drop of water. And it's not. It's the other way around. This theory is something that you can either accept or reject subjectively, independently of the theory itself. The subject does not depend on that theory. The subjective value of things don't depend on that theory. The theory is only about relativity and things that are inside the field of relativity, not subjectivity. Now, what it does is, like dimensions, right? First dimension encapsulates or includes the zeroth dimension beneath it, right? Every dimension includes the dimensions below it. So the theory has a subjective nature. That's true. It is part of relativity is subjectivity. You've got subjective, we'll say variables, P and Q. What's the difference between P and Q? Well, relativistically speaking, they have their set of relations. P operates with R conjunctively, let's say, and Q operates with R with a negation, let's say. And so then that's how you discern them, is if you were to have them interact with R, one of them will be conjunctive and the other one will be negative, negation of it. So it's, you can define P and Q relativistically that way, but it never tells you what P and Q actually are. It just tells you how they function. It tells you how they relate to R specifically in that example, but it doesn't tell you what they are in and of themselves. If you were to isolate them from R, you would have no definition of what P and Q are. So if you were to isolate P and Q from R, then they're identical. They're interchangeable. They're indiscernible. There's no way of telling them apart. The only way you can tell them apart is through the relation with R. If R is present, then you can measure it. If it's not, then you can't. So it's a catch as catch can kind of a thing with the relativistic way of looking at things. You don't get all the way in. You don't get to penetrate all the way into the intrinsic endemic nature of P. You only get to the interactive way it relates to R versus how it relates to Q. So and versus how Q relates to R. So it tells you about the volume of the environment that P exists in, and the volume of the environment that P exists within is a relativistic environment of the relations that it has with Q and R, and the relations that R and Q have with themselves, and each other. So that there's this environment of relations, and that exists in relativity in the first dimension. And then you can extend that into an objective arrangement if you wanted to, and you can regress it or reduce it back to a subjective referent, such as P. But you can't use just relativity alone to determine what the value of P itself is. You can only determine its relative value as being more or less like Q or R. So, and when I say like, I just mean indiscernible from, interchangeable with. Where if you were to take something which is like or similar to something else, then they would be functionally equivalent in whatever equation or function that you're having them interact with something else. It will produce the same result if they're similar. So these types of ways of dealing with the world are all relativistic. But if you were to then erroneously apply them to the subjective field, it would be kind of like calling a person a number, or subject a machine, or it doesn't fit. It doesn't fit in that field. It doesn't belong to that category. It doesn't go there. It doesn't fit there. So, and it's the same thing that happens when you try to extend it into physics and science and say, well, if this really is the complete laws of all the things that make everything real, then why can't it tell me what an apple tastes like? Why does it have, for example, the inability to predict where an object is going to be? I mean, it can tell you about systems if those systems are relative, but it can't tell you about the objective, substantive, physical laws that are governing whatever happens in the real world. For example, I can't tell you why things fall towards the center of the earth at 8 meters per second squared. I don't know where that comes from. I can't derive that equation from my theory. I can tell you, I might be able to derive force equals mass times acceleration, but I don't think I could ever derive 8 meters per second squared. That level of specificity is so specific that I think my theory would probably find it arbitrary or indiscernible from an arbitration, because it's so independent from the relativity from which it emerges. So I don't think it's possible right now. I don't think it's possible to extend this theory into physics. I think that a separate independent physical theory will have to emerge first. And then hopefully there can be a bridge in between that independently derived physical law or set of laws and my theory of relativity and mind and logic and validity and all that. I know that the second dimension, which is a 3-reference system, which is an objective field, which is the form from which actual physical manifestations in the third dimension, which requires a 4th referent, would take. So it's pretty solid as far as like the theory can predict what those other systems will have as their properties, but it won't be able to specify the exact numerical values that you're going to find in there. The specificities are independent, but the generalities, yes, you could derive those. I just can't explain why it's 8 of all numbers, and I don't know why that is. And I don't know why a foot is 1 foot long. I don't know that level of specificity with this theory. It's not possible to explain that in relativity because in relativity, there's only two reference. There's not room for a third to tell you substantively why it forms in this way. I believe that geometric form, which is the second dimension of objectivity, I believe that field is in a way independent from and yet composed at least partly of the second dimension of relativity and logical validity and integration beneath it. So geometry stems from algebra, but algebra, no matter how much you study algebra, you can never for certain derive directly the geometric form of something. For example, given Euclidean postulates, right? They say that will establish the form of the Euclidean geometry from those postulates. The postulates exist in relativity. Unless they're making a geometric assertion about a shape. For example, if it says point or line or whatever, you can relativistically determine and define what a point is, and then you can relativistically extend a point into a line, and then you can extend the line into a square. But trying to relativistically describe the difference between a line and a square, or between a point and a line, while it is possible, is extremely difficult. There's a piece of it that's always missing. That's like, okay, I understand the relation of orthogonal, but if I've never actually experienced that orthogonal direction before, like a flatlander, I would never be able to to somehow, in some weird bout of psychotic madness mixed with genius, somehow derive or innovate or invent or discover some what the direction that is orthogonal to the second dimension into the third dimension. I would never be able to understand what that extension would look like from a flatlander's perspective in the second dimension. I would never be able to just conjure in my head what that would look like. I would never be able to conjure the third dimension and visualize that in my head if I've only ever experienced the second dimension. And the reason is because the third dimension, like I said, it has its own independence that you can't be. It's not dependent upon the second dimension. The second dimension is dependent upon it. And that's what makes it impossible for you to derive the third dimension from the second dimension. But what you can do is you can derive the second dimension from the third dimension. So you can always regress and reduce back, but you can never progress and project forward without some random, magical, mystical, seemingly impossible, miraculous, transcendental shift in the way that you're looking at something. Because whatever that is, that openness to learning mindset, rather than the certainty of the teacher, you have the uncertainty of the student. And so it's not like what the teacher is doing basically is trying to build an enclosure. They're trying to build a crystalline structure to which the student can refer in the same way that any other student could refer. And they would all interchangeably come to the same conclusion given some premise. That's what the teacher's trying to do. Now, that is an act of constraint. It's actually not an act of invention or creativity. It's an act of analyzation, reduction, and constraint and limitation. And it's saying, this is where the line is. This is where the line is. This is where the line is. And it doesn't tell you what else is out there. It pretends that there is nothing else out there because it has to focus on what you're trying to learn. So those directions are opposite each other. the teacher is constraining things, but the student is opening up and building new ideas, right? When they learn, they're discovering new things rather than revisiting old things. So what that means is when somebody comes up with their own physical structure theory about why it is that it's 8 meters per second squared on Earth instead of it being 16 or 17 or whatever it is, whatever it could be. And they tell me this is inescapably why it has to be the number 8 meters per second squared that something falls. And it, I would assume, have something to do with its mass. And then I ask, okay, well, how do I derive its mass? And then you run out of words for that person because there isn't one. I mean, it just has a mass. Well, why? Well, that's that independent, orthogonal direction of extending the second dimension into the third dimension. It's independent. Why does it have that direction? It just does. Why does it have that direction? I don't know. It just does. It just has that as its structure. That's just the structure that it has. And there isn't an explanation for why that is the case. It's just functional and operational in that way. And it isn't if it were changed. And so it's like, okay, well, that explains how it's maintained, that explains how it's sustained and continued and perpetuated, but it doesn't tell me how it originates. And it doesn't tell me what happens if it were to terminate either. So it has its limitations. Every single theory does. My theory is philosophical, logical, and rational. It doesn't have anything to do with empiricism, which appears in the second dimension, not the third, second dimension. And the difference between form, which you'll find in the second dimension, which is objective and geometrical, it's also idealized. And this is one of the things that I think might start to work in someone's head as far as like, okay, now I get it. Now I understand what the difference is between these dimensions, the reference and all that stuff. You have to visualize it. And I think people would probably be able to understand the difference between the second and third dimension and the third and fourth dimension rather than the zeroth and the first, because it's just too fundamental and raw for people to wrap their heads around because they don't spend all day long thinking about that kind of thing. But we do think about, what there is a difference between geometry, between like my image, let's say, of the geometrical shape of a sphere versus a balloon or an actual, or like two bowls on top of each other, or something like that, or a globe, or, like a map in 3 dimensions. That all those are not exactly a perfect sphere. You don't ever find a perfect sphere. Out of all the examples of spheres that we have, we don't have a single perfect one. So how do we know what a perfect sphere looks like? Well, we know that from relativity, because we know that a perfect sphere is the shape where every single peripheral point at the surface of the sphere is exactly the same distance from the center of the sphere as every other point on the surface of that sphere. So that there is there's no deviation. The curvature is continuous and it's infinitely smooth, meaning that there is no point at which there's a little L-shape orthogonal change. So there's no divots, there's no puddles, there's no troughs, there's no crevices. It's just a continuously, perfectly smooth, exact curvature of a sphere, because every single point is exactly the same distance from the center as every other point on the surface of that sphere. We don't find that anywhere in nature. We don't find that anywhere in physical manifestation in the third dimension. And we don't find it in the fourth dimension either. We don't find it in any dimension except that one dimension, the second dimension, the third dimension. The third dimension. So when you get into a sphere, that's different than a circle. The circle exists in 2 dimensions. Or, as I like to argue, the circle is actually a one-dimensional line which is fed into itself. And because it's fed into itself, the only way that you can really see it is from the second dimension. And when you're in the second dimension, then you're seeing the first dimensional circle. It's actually a line. It's one line. The circle is one line. It's one dimensional. It's a one-dimensional object. And it's a line because you can describe it in one dimension. You can say that a circle is simply that which has its origin as indiscernible from its terminus and yet is non-zero. Now, what that produces then is an infinite line. And then when you are, because you're looking at it sideways, right? You're looking at it from the side. And so then when you flip it and you start looking at it from the top or the bottom, then you've gone into the second dimension, and then you can see the circle in its full form because the circle is an infinite object. It can only be viewed as one dimension above itself. But the circle itself is one-dimensional. It's just an infinitely one-dimensional object. So it fully encompasses that dimension from which it is an object. It is the object of totality of that system, of that field. So that if you were in the first dimension, then you would not be able to tell a circle from an infinite line because they would be identical, because their origin and their terminus would be indiscernible from each other. The line being that their origin and terminus are outside, so you never see them. And the circle being that the origin and the terminus are the same point, and it's just replicated an infinite number of times. And that's what makes it bend into a curvature, is because it can't be fully explained in the dimension that it exists. So you have to go one step above it just to be able to explain the totality of it, because it's so total that it can't be expressed fully in the dimension that it's actually in. It's like bursting out of the dimension that it exists within. Or you could say it's sharing the same limits as the field that it's supposed to be an object of, in which case it would be like a box that contains itself. It's like, is it in the box or is it the box itself? Well, you can't tell because they're both the same thing. So you run into an issue with it because it's like the referent has become the dimension, and the dimension is the environment of the referent. So the referent in the example of a circle, the referent is, there is two referents of a circle, the origin and the terminus, or if you like, the conjunction of the origin and the terminus with there not being zero distance between them, that they aren't the same. So the origin and the terminus, if they were the same, it would be a point. If they are indiscernible, so they're not identical, but they can't be told apart from each other, and there's a non-zero distance between them, but that distance is necessarily also indiscernible because they're indiscernible from each other, then you get into a circle. So the point, the infinite line, and the circle are kind of a good way of trying to visualize how you would progress through the dimensions. So you've got the zeroth dimension, that's the point. That's where the origin and the terminus are the same. And they're identical. They're not just indiscernible. They're actually the same point. So a point begins exactly where it ends. It doesn't have any distance between where it begins and where it ends. It just has the origin as its own terminus. A point can be easily derived from nothing because nothing causes itself and nothing has its origin the same as its terminus. So then therefore, because nothing can and does cause itself, it is its own, its effect is its cause. They're identical. They're not just indiscernible. They're actually identical. They're the same thing. And that's what makes it special. And so you can say that that's also what a point is. A point would be an expression of that in where its origin is identical to and is the same as its terminus. Only with a point, we're talking about that existing in some kind of a spatial field or a spatial existence, I guess. Just that function of origination equals termination. And that function is a point. And you could say then that it isn't actually an object at all, it's a function, and that's true. And that's one of the reasons that it's zero-dimensional, is because it doesn't have a dimension, because it's not actually an object that extends into space. It's something that establishes space because it establishes it as, I guess you would say, that which is beyond or is not the function of its origin being the same as its terminus. So when you say that something is where its origin is its terminus, then that's basically nothing, because nothing has its origin the same as its terminus. It's a function of nothing. And then if you go beyond that to say that it then becomes discernible as a two-referent system, you've got that as the first referent, the function of origination equals termination. That's the first referent. And the second referent would then have to be that the origination is not the termination, and that's what creates space. And that's the space or abstract dimension within which the point exists. And that dimension is the zeroth dimension. It's not quite exactly a dimension because it's unbounded, and it doesn't really have a whole lot of constraint on it. The limit of it is actually just the limit of that function. So that when you try to render space, you have to render the point at its center, and then you get infinite space with a point at the center. So you don't actually have a space that can exist that isn't a sphere with a point at its center. That's the only way that you could possibly have rendered space. So now, if you are talking about the zeroth dimension, what you're then talking about is if you were to zoom all the way into that sphere to its center point, then you would say that the center of that center point is the function, and that the periphery of that center point is the expression or the outcome or the negation of that, which would then be infinitely far away from that function, which would then be the establishment of that orthogonal direction extending from an abstract function of the origination equals termination, and you extend that function into something orthogonal, into a new space, which is infinitely far away from that function, which is everything that is not the origination equaling the termination. Namely, the origination is discernible from, or is not the same, at least. It's not discernible, but it's anti-discernible, I guess you would say, from the terminus. So the origin and the terminus, while they might not be exactly decoupled, they are at least not identical. They're not the same exact point. They're just indiscernible from each other. So we're taking a concrete certainty, which is the function, and we're turning it into a blurry, unbounded, limited but unbounded fuzziness that sort of diffusely extends beyond the limit of that function everywhere else that you could possibly imagine that would fit within any reference frame. And that is then the establishment of what it is to be a dimension, which is the reference frame. That's all it is. It's just the limits or the boundary of the reference frame. The limit is the function. The boundary is the reference frame. So if you were to take the limit, which is the edge of the function, origination equals termination, the edge of that is the limit of its negation, which is the origination is not the termination. And that other, I guess you'd call it a function, which is the negation of that original function, that establishes what space is. That establishes the distance between one thing and another thing. And so then you've got two referents. One referent is the original function, origin equals termination, and the second referent is the secondary negation of that function, which is origination is not termination. So that, and you can see that. I mean, it's so elegant, and this is the thing that starts to scare me, is like, that is so perfect that there's no way that you could ever say it's wrong. It just fundamentally describes what it is to be a point, what it is to be a referent, what it is to be spacious, or what spatial distance in fact is, which is the distinction, the the difference, the change in between the function of origination equals termination and the function of origination is not termination. And those two functions have a contrast. They have a contradiction between them. They can't both be true in the same place at the same time. So there's a distinction between them. And that distinction is what allows us the ability to discern such that everything that is in the field of relativity can ultimately be reduced to that simple relation between those two referents, the referent of where the origination is the termination and the referent where the origin is not the termination. So that's my favorite. That's what I think is the most profound, the most awesome part of the theory, because it's the closest to absolutely nothing that you could get. It's so subtle, but yet it's so huge and vast and ethereal and mysterious and abstract. And I love it. So that's, how you begin to extend from referent to reference frame, referent to, I was right. So referent to reference frame to new reference frame, a second reference frame. So there's the reference frame that is immediately surrounding the, let's say, subject or point. So the point has a surface area, which is infinitesimally small. It's the size of the distance between those two functions. And the distance between those two functions is equivalent to 1 divided by infinity. And the reason is because an infinity is a totality, and the totality, though, is unbounded, but it's not unlimited. So it has a limit, but it doesn't have boundaries. And what that means is it's a voluminous propagation of points, but it's open so that there's no end. It just goes on and on and on and on and on and on forever. And that's what makes it infinite. Then when you zoom all the way out of that, then you can actually compress that infinitude into a singularity. And you can say that that's one totality of all those points occupying one something, one field, one sphere, one dot, one point, one area, one volume, whatever. And that's the thing that is containing, that is immediately adjacent to the thing that is being contained. And it's the adjacentness that gives it the independence and the orthogonal direction to the thing that is being contained, or the thing that it is adjacent to. So that is as subtle as you can possibly ever get. No being could ever get more subtle than that, as far as, generally speaking, as far as fields. Then you can get specifically, you can zoom into that, but that's everything after that is just points. You don't ever end up finding another boundary that is as subtle as that. That's the last boundary. After that, everything is just limits. And the difference between limits and boundaries is limits define centers. Boundaries define peripheries. So if it doesn't have, it can be unbounded, but limited. And it could also be unbounded and unlimited. If it is unbounded and unlimited, then it's either infinite or it's, I guess, not there. It's either everywhere or nowhere. And in either case, it's relativistically something that you just discard or disregard, because it's either always applicable or it's never applicable. So then you don't have any change in your equations. Your equations will be the same whether you say it's always there or never there. It doesn't have any difference as far as in between your equations. Those two states would, of course, be different, but inside of them, they're the same. But between them, they're different. So there's all kinds of these abstractions in the theory. But anyway, at some point, I'm going to compile all of this. And I think that's the route that I'm going to take with the theory, is the dimensional route. It's going to talk about reference, dimensions, reference frames, all that kind of thing, and why they exist and why they're important and how they fundamentally describe our ability to discern things. It does not tell us what they are, but it does tell us how we can discern them. So it's a theory of mind. It's not a theory of of reality. And it's not a religion. It's not a theory of God. It's just a theory of relativity. It's just a theory of basic logic. What is logic in and of itself? Define it in and of itself, that kind of a thing. And that, I think, is the closest that I can render it so far, is logic is the process by which we start from a referent and we end with an infinitude of reference frames, dimensions, plus one referent after that. And that referent in the theory is I. It's just whatever you want, anything. You could put anything in there. It's a placeholder. You could put whatever you want, the plus one referent that's beyond theory. You could put whatever you want there. So in other words, the theory will be at home wherever it goes. It doesn't exclude anything. It just lets everything be whatever it is. Lucidity specifically refers to God as that which is outside of reality, creation. And that is dangerous, because what that says is that I know who God is, I know what God wants, I can derive God's will, and I can manifest it, and I can then become God. I can then be an extension of God, because things causally are either independent from each other, at which point they're two different things, or they're dependent. One of them is dependent on the other one, at which point one of them is a part of or an extension of the other one. So if I just do whatever God says, let's say, then I am just a part of God. I'm God's finger or something like that, God's hands, If I do something other than that, then I'm my own person. But if I do whatever he says all the time, just because he said it, automatically do it, there's no difference between me then and God. There's no difference between, just like there's no difference between my finger and me. It's like, well, yeah, my finger is a part of me. And so if I, chop it off, then I continue to exist, but my finger doesn't. It just stops being my finger and it starts being a cut off, discarded flesh piece. And then that rots and decays and turns into bones left on the ground, but not a finger. Just, the skeleton of what was once a finger. So it's the same thing between me and God. And if I say that I can refer to God, and I say that I can refer to God's will, and I say that it is a moral law that creating is good and destroying is evil, all the time, everywhere, for everybody, for all time. If I say that, I've made an error, because I actually don't know if that's true or not, and there's no way to prove or disprove that. So there's not really a way of turning that into a logical theory anymore. It becomes unfalsifiable and thus fallacious.